Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I never believed in fate. I always thought that if you worked hard enough and controlled what you could, your future was yours to shape. But that was before I got the letter. Before I received a piece of paper marked with a stamp from a future that hadn't even arrived yet. Have you ever wondered how you would react if you were given a glimpse into the future? A chance to see the moments that would define the days ahead? If you could know what was coming, would you try to stop it or simply let it unfold? That was the question that haunted me as I held the letter in my hands. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that slips through your fingers without much thought. The envelope was unremarkable, the handwriting neat but unfamiliar. The stamp was what caught my attention first. It was marked with a date that hadn't yet come, 2 weeks from today. I had to reread the date 3 times before it sank in. How could this be? A letter from the future, from a time that hadn't even happened yet. It seemed impossible, ridiculous even. I half expected it to be a prank, some elaborate joke, but the weight of it felt different. The paper, the ink, it was too real. I tore open the envelope slowly, my fingers trembling as I did. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message written on it was short, yet chilling in its precision. On March 25th, at precisely 5:15 p.m., you will receive an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end will sound familiar, but you will not recognize it at first. The news will shake you to your core. Do not ignore the warning. I stared at the words, the quiet hum of the world around me fading into the background. How could this be possible? How could anyone know what would happen in 2 weeks with such detail? I looked at the letter again, and for the first time, I felt a chill creep up my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had gotten access to my life, my routines, my contacts, my habits, but no. The details in the letter, the time, the specificity of the phone call, the voice, it wasn't something anyone could have guessed. It felt too personal. I set the letter down on the kitchen table and tried to focus on something else. But my mind kept drifting back to the words. Do not ignore the warning. I knew, deep down, that I couldn't just forget about this. The letter had planted a seed of fear in me, and I could already feel it growing, twisting my thoughts. If this was real, if this letter was really from the future, then something was going to happen. And I didn't know if I was ready for it. The next 2 weeks stretched ahead of me, each day marked by the ticking of the clock, counting down to the moment when the phone call would come. I tried to prepare myself, but how do you prepare for something that may, or may not, happen? How do you prepare for the unknown? As the days passed, I began to notice things that felt off. Small things at first. The way my phone seemed to ring more often than usual, but no one was on the other end when I picked up. The feeling that I was being watched just out of the corner of my eye. I chalked it up to nerves, to the tension building as the day in the letter drew nearer. But then came the night before. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the nagging feeling that was building in my chest. That's when I heard it, a soft knock on the door. It was late, too late for a visitor. Hesitantly, I stood up and approached the door. My heart raced as I wondered who could possibly be here. Could it be someone from the future, someone trying to warn me about what was to come? I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there with an explanation. But there was nothing. Only the quiet night air, carrying with it the faintest sound of distant traffic. I closed the door, feeling both relieved and more unsettled than ever. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the letter was just a coincidence, a product of an overactive mind. But I knew, deep down, that tomorrow was coming. And with it, the phone call. The one that was supposed to shake me to my core. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't in the phone call at all. It was in the possibility that this letter, this strange, impossible letter, wasn't just a warning. It was a manipulation. A message sent not to help me, but to control me. And that, more than anything, terrified me. Because if the future could send me a letter, then maybe, just maybe, it could shape my choices. And if it could shape my choices, who was really in control? As I sat back down on the couch, the clock ticking loudly in the silence, I realized that there was no escaping tomorrow. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, the future was already here, waiting. And the phone call, it was only the beginning. The hours between now and the moment the letter predicted seemed to crawl by at an agonizing pace. Each tick of the clock, each breath, felt heavier, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. It was only a matter of time before everything changed. I tried to live in denial, to push the thought of the phone call out of my mind. It was impossible, I told myself. It was a fluke, a coincidence. But I couldn't escape the reality that tomorrow, at precisely 5:15 p.m., something was going to happen. I couldn't tell if I was terrified or relieved by the certainty of it. I found myself looking at the clock more and more, watching the hands slowly move toward the time that had been so vividly etched into my mind. Every passing minute felt like I was being drawn into some inevitable trap. I tried to distract myself with work, with books, with anything I could find. But no matter how much I tried to fill my hours, I could still hear the echo of those words, "Do not ignore the warning." By the time evening came, I was a bundle of nerves, pacing around my apartment, convinced that every phone ring, every knock on the door, every sound that echoed through the walls of my apartment was somehow related to the events of the letter. I even began to wonder if the letter itself was some kind of trick, or worse, a test. What if it wasn't from the future at all? What if someone had found a way to manipulate me, to twist my reality in ways I couldn't even begin to understand? But there was one undeniable truth: the date was drawing closer. Tomorrow was the day. The night passed slowly, each minute dragging by with agonizing slowness. I barely slept, my mind racing, my body tense with anticipation. And when the first light of dawn broke through the window, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was already shifting in the air. The world felt different. As though it, too, was waiting for the phone call. Waiting for the future to arrive. And then, it was 5 p.m. I was sitting in my living room, staring at the clock on the wall, my fingers trembling slightly. My phone was on the table in front of me, its screen dark and still. I watched it, waiting. My breath hitched when I heard the faintest buzz. My phone was vibrating. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. No call. No message. Nothing. Just a text notification from a friend asking how my day was going. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Was it a mistake, after all? Had the letter been a cruel joke? I picked up my phone and typed back a response, my fingers moving faster than my mind could process. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, as if something, or someone, was watching me. And then, at 5:15 p.m. exactly, my phone rang. I froze. The sound of the ringtone was deafening, almost mocking in its familiarity. The voice on the other end, deep, warm, and unmistakably human, was equally familiar. Yet, I couldn't place it. I couldn't remember who it was, and that terrified me. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling, betraying the calm I was trying so hard to maintain. There was a long pause before the voice responded, "It's me." The words were simple, but they sent a wave of panic rushing through me. It's me. But who was me? Why couldn't I recognize the voice? I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for the voice to say more, but the line was silent. I strained my ears, hoping for an answer. And then, faintly, there was a sound, like someone breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate. Suddenly, I wasn't sure if the voice was human at all. "Who is this?" I managed to ask, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice chuckled softly, almost reassuringly. "You know who I am." The words sent a shiver down my spine. There was no way to know who was calling. There was no way to recognize this voice, and yet it felt too familiar. It felt as though it had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. "I don't know who you are," I said, my throat dry. And then there was silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing in on you, swallowing the air around you. The silence that leaves you feeling exposed, vulnerable. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the call ended. The line went dead. I was left sitting there, staring at my phone, completely still. Was that the warning? Was this the moment that would shake me to my core? I didn't know. I didn't understand. But what I did know, deep in the pit of my stomach, was that the phone call hadn't been a coincidence. It wasn't just a voice. It wasn't just a call. Something was happening. Something was unfolding, and I had no idea where it would lead or how I could stop it. All I knew was that the future was no longer something distant and unknowable. It had just stepped into my living room, and I had no idea how to send it back. The ringing in my ears didn't stop. I was alone in my apartment, but it felt as if the world was pressing against the walls, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The phone call had ended, but the unsettling sensation lingered, a heavy weight on my chest. I had always been a person of reason, of logic. I could explain away most things, find the simplest solution to every problem. But this was beyond explanation. I looked at the phone again, as if somehow the device itself would offer me an answer. But there was nothing. No message. No hint of who had just called. Just the silence. It took me a few moments to realize that my fingers were still trembling. I wasn't sure whether it was from fear or from some strange adrenaline coursing through my veins. Every instinct in me screamed to investigate further, to find out who was behind the call, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The silence was too loud, too oppressive. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from the apartment, from the suffocating weight of uncertainty. The outside world felt like a refuge, even if I wasn't sure what was waiting for me out there. I grabbed my coat, not caring if I was making sense of anything. The cold air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, but it wasn't enough to clear the fog from my mind. I walked through the streets, my footsteps echoing in the quiet evening. There were people around, but they seemed like shadows, like actors in a play that I wasn't meant to be a part of. I moved like a ghost through the crowd. The city felt so ordinary. so mundane. And yet, the weight of the letter, the voice on the phone, hung over everything. The people walking beside me, the passing cars, the neon lights, all seemed to blur together. Nothing felt right. At some point, I found myself standing outside a small cafe. The warm light spilling out of the windows was like a beacon, a small piece of normalcy. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, hoping that a hot cup of coffee would help clear my mind. The bell above the door jingled, but the sound felt strangely distant, like it came from far away. I ordered my coffee and took a seat by the window, my fingers tapping nervously on the table. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter, about the phone call, about everything I have read. Do not ignore the warning. I tried to shake it off. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than some weird coincidence. But the longer I sat there, the more the feeling of dread crawled up my spine. There was no denying it anymore. Something was coming. And that thought paralyzed me. What was it? Who was it? Why me? I was still staring out the window, lost in my thoughts, when the door opened again. The bell above it rang again, but this time it was followed by a familiar sound, the soft shuffle of footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. I turned my head, half expecting to see someone I knew, but no one was there. No one at all. Except for the letter. The letter from the future. It sat on the table next to me, as if it had always been there. As if it had been placed there by some invisible hand. The shock of it hit me like a slap to the face. I hadn't seen anyone approach, hadn't noticed anyone placing it there. But there it was, the letter, staring at me with its strange, otherworldly stamp, its words still etched in my mind. I reached for it slowly, the paper cooled beneath my fingertips. As I lifted it, I noticed something else. The envelope was sealed, yet it was slightly open, as if it had been tampered with. My breath caught in my throat. The handwriting was the same as before. Neat, precise. The same eerie description of events that would unfold in the next few days. But this time, it was different. The letter didn't just describe my day. It described the choices I would make. The ones I hadn't even thought about yet. It was as if someone had already seen my future, already knew what I was going to do, even before I did. But there was more. The final line was different this time. You will make the wrong choice. It's already too late. My fingers trembled as I held the letter. My mind raced. What was this? How could it know? How could it be so certain? I looked around the cafe, half expecting someone to be watching me. But the place was empty, save for the barista behind the counter, who was busily cleaning glasses. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone, somewhere, who was watching me. Manipulating me. I wanted to rip the letter up, to burn it, to destroy it before it could do any more damage. But I couldn't. The words seemed to hold me in place, like a spell, like they had power over me. I wanted to be in control again, to break free from this nightmare, but the truth was, I was already caught in its grip. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second pushing me closer to what? I didn't know, but I felt it. I felt the pull of something coming, something I couldn't stop. The letter was just the beginning. I didn't know what to do next. Every fiber of my being screamed for action, for some way to break free of this twisted situation, but there were no answers. No simple explanations. No safe path to follow. The letter was still in my hands. I could feel its weight as I stared at the final line. The words burned into my mind. You will make the wrong choice. It's already too late. What did it mean? How could it know what choices I would make? How could it be so certain about the future? It was as if my life had been written out in some cruel script, and I was just playing my part, doomed to fail. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I looked around the cafe again. The barista was still busy with his work, his back turned to me. No one else was here. But the letter had been placed so deliberately on the table, as if someone had watched me, as if they knew I would be here. My mind raced. Could this be some elaborate prank? Or was it something far worse? Something supernatural? I tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to me like a shadow, growing stronger with every passing second. The coffee I had ordered was cold by now, and I pushed it aside. I couldn't drink it. I couldn't focus on anything except the letter and the chilling sense that something terrible was about to happen. As I looked at the door, I half expected someone to walk in, someone who could give me answers. But no one came. Only the quiet hum of the lights above and the occasional clink of cups in the kitchen. Then, just as I was about to stand up and leave, the door opened again. A figure stepped inside. For a moment, I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't just anyone. It was a man I didn't recognize, but there was something familiar about him, something hauntingly so. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. My breath caught in my throat as he walked over, his footsteps slow but deliberate. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, as if the world itself had locked me in place. He stopped right next to my table and leaned in, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "You're not supposed to know," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But it's too late now, isn't it?" I could barely respond. What was happening? Who was he? How did he know? I stared at him, my mind swirling with questions, but before I could speak, he turned and walked away, as if he had never been there. I watched him leave, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment he stepped out the door, the tension in the cafe seemed to lift, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. I glanced at the clock. The time had passed quickly. I had been sitting there for longer than I realized. I was running out of time. I had to leave. I had to get away from here, from whatever was happening. But as I stood up, I noticed something strange. The letter was gone. It wasn't on the table anymore. It was as if it had never been there. I looked around the cafe, panicking. Had I imagined it? Was this some kind of trick? I rushed to the door, pushing it open and stepping out into the cold night air. The streets were dark, but the city was still alive with movement. People walked by, oblivious to the turmoil in my mind. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure standing at the far end of the street. The man. He was just standing there, watching me. His face was barely visible, but his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were fixed on me. I turned away quickly, my legs moving faster than I could think. I needed to get home. I needed to be safe. But the further I walked, the closer I felt he was. The sound of his footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but he wasn't there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. He was close. He was always close. I quickened my pace, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he following me? And where had the letter gone? Suddenly, My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, almost afraid to look, but my eyes went straight to the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. You've made the wrong choice. The end is coming. The words were a punch to my gut. I could feel the ground beneath me shift, as if everything I thought I knew was crumbling away. My chest tightened, and I stopped in my tracks. I looked around, but there was no sign of the man. No one seemed to notice me, lost in their own worlds, walking by with the same obliviousness as always. I had to find answers, but I didn't know where to look. I didn't know who to trust. And now was when I realized there was no escaping this. No way to undo what had already been set in motion. Whatever was coming, it was already too late. I stood frozen in place, my phone still in my trembling hand. The words on the screen glared at me, harsh and unyielding. You've made the wrong choice. The end is coming. The weight of those words pressed heavily against my chest, and for a moment it felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. I was suffocating in my own panic, unable to move, unable to breathe. The street was silent around me, save for the low hum of distant traffic and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. But then something shifted. A low sound, a whisper, perhaps, drifted through the air. I strained to listen, but the street remained eerily quiet. I turned, half expecting the man to be standing right behind me. But there was no one. No sign of him. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the world itself had become a stage, and I was the sole actor trapped in a never-ending play. The uncertainty, the fear, it was all consuming. I looked at my phone again. I wanted to delete the message, to erase it from my mind. But I couldn't. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't tear my gaze away from the screen. The words seemed to crawl across my vision, mocking me, pushing me closer to the edge. The end is coming. What did that even mean? I needed to go home. I needed to find some kind of answer. Some kind of explanation that made sense. I couldn't continue like this, lost in this strange nightmare. I turned and began walking back toward my apartment, my footsteps quick and uneven. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long shadows across the pavement. The further I walked, the heavier the atmosphere became. I was aware of every noise, every gust of wind, every rustle in the trees, every distant sound of traffic. It all seemed to be closing in around me. As I rounded the corner near my apartment building, I caught sight of something at the far end of the street. The man. He was standing there again, his figure just barely visible in the dim light. His posture was still, like he was waiting for something, like he had been waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat, and my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know how he had gotten there, but there was no mistaking it. He was the same man from earlier. The one who had spoken to me in the cafe. The one who had left me the letter. This time, I didn't stop. I didn't hesitate. My legs carried me forward, faster than I thought possible, until I reached the entrance of my building. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. The man didn't move. He stood there, watching me, his eyes never leaving mine. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare glance over my shoulder as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment I entered, the door slammed shut behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, as if the mere act of stepping inside had been a battle in itself. I was safe, for now, but I knew it wouldn't last. I could feel the weight of the letter in my mind, the feeling of doom that clung to me. The message on my phone echoed in my ears, its meaning clear now. The end was inevitable. I had to do something. I had to stop it. But what could I do? How could I change what was already written? I walked through the dark apartment, my mind racing. My eyes landed on the table where I had placed the letter earlier. It was gone. Vanished. The same way it had disappeared in the cafe. The same way it had vanished when the man had appeared. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up in sheer terror. The letter. It wasn't just a warning. It was a symbol. A sign that whatever was happening was beyond my control. Then, I remembered something. Something I hadn't fully understood until now. The first line of the letter had said something important. Tomorrow will be the day you realize what's happening. Tomorrow. It had always been tomorrow. And now tomorrow was here. The air around me grew colder. I looked out the window, staring into the empty street below. The city looked the same, ordinary, quiet. But something was wrong. I felt it in my bones. The world felt off balance, like something unseen was watching, waiting for me to make the next move. Suddenly, the phone in my hand buzzed again. My breath caught in my throat. A message. From the same unknown number. Tomorrow, you will understand. But it will be too late. My hand shook as I dropped the phone to the floor. The words echoed in my mind, bouncing around like a constant drumbeat. Too late. That's what they wanted me to believe. They wanted me to accept that nothing could change. That I was powerless. That tomorrow, the end would come, and I would be helpless to stop it. But I wouldn't give in. I couldn't. I would fight. I would find a way to escape this, to break free from whatever cruel fate had been written for me. But as the seconds ticked by, I realized something even more terrifying. What if there was no way out? What if everything that was happening was part of something I couldn't control? The end, it seemed, had already begun. It was late in the evening when I first heard the sound. A slight scrape. Nothing much, just a disturbance in the silence that was usually so thick around here. I didn't think much of it at the time, just the usual creak of metal or the wind shifting something in the storage room. But then it came again. A second scrape, this time a little louder. I stood there, at my post, behind the thick glass of the security booth, watching the dimly lit warehouse. The flickering overhead lights gave off an almost surreal glow. The entire place felt like a ghost of what it used to be. My shift at the warehouse was uneventful most of the time. It was a dead-end job, if I'm being honest. I'd spent endless hours staring at empty shelves and the cold, gray walls of the storage area. There was nothing there but old boxes and machinery, all of it covered in dust from years of disuse. But that evening felt different. I strained my ears to listen. The scrape had turned into something more distinct, like a tapping, rhythmic and steady. It was coming from the far corner of the warehouse. The area was abandoned, sealed off for years. I knew that because I had been working here long enough to remember when it was last used. No one had stepped foot in that section in months. A chill ran through me. I checked the monitors again, but the feed was grainy. The camera in that corner had always been faulty. Still, the sounds kept coming, tapping, then scratching, like something trying to claw its way through the concrete walls. I grabbed the radio and called for a sweep of the warehouse, my voice almost trembling as I spoke. Hey, can someone check Section C? Something's not right. There was no response. I shook my head, pushing the unsettling feeling aside. It was probably just an animal or some other innocent explanation. I had to get my head straight. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. Not here. Not in this place. Still, I couldn't stop staring at that section of the warehouse. I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right. The tension in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. I glanced down at the security system logs. The lights in Section C had been out for weeks. The last time anyone had entered that area was months ago, long before my shift began. The doors to this section had been locked and marked "Do Not Enter." And yet, the sounds continued. Then, as I was about to call for backup again, I saw it. A shadow moved in front of the frosted glass. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Maybe the wind was causing the shadows to shift. But the shadow didn't move like a gust of air. It moved with intention. It was standing in front of the glass. I froze. It was hard to tell from this distance, but the figure seemed too still, too unnatural. My heart began to race. I wanted to call out, to speak into the intercom, but my throat tightened. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, facing me through the glass, as if waiting. Waiting for what? I pressed my hand against the glass, trying to steady my breathing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice weak. No response. Then the figure shifted. It didn't turn. It didn't walk. It just shifted, like it had been standing there all along and had only now decided to move. I watched in horror as it drew closer to the glass. Each step was slow, deliberate, and unnerving. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to flee, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. My eyes never left the glass, watching as the figure slowly pressed its face against the surface. For a moment, I thought I saw its eyes. Dark. Empty. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed for me to call for help, to run, to scream. But all I could do was watch, frozen in place. I was alone. There was no one else around. The tapping, the scratching, the shadow, none of it made sense. I couldn't explain it. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. But the sound didn't stop. I turned my attention back to the tapping. Now it was closer. Much closer. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I thought I could hear breathing, too. I needed to find out what was going on. But every step I took toward the door felt like a step deeper into something I wasn't ready to face. And as the sound of the breathing grew louder, I realized that whatever was on the other side of that glass wasn't just waiting. It was coming. Coming for me. The night was only just beginning. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours, though I was sure it was only minutes. The breathing, if that's what it was, grew louder, more deliberate. I could hear it even through the thick glass. Deep, heavy, almost slow. Like someone, or something, was standing right on the other side, just waiting for me to move. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to give in to the fear creeping up my spine, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, my eyes drifted to the corner, to the section where the shadow had stood. Moments before. There was nothing there now. Just the cold, empty expanse of the warehouse, the flickering lights casting an eerie glow on the abandoned shelves. But I knew. I could feel it. Something was still there. My hand shook as I reached for the radio, but before I could press the button, a sharp noise cut through the air. It was a loud, scraping sound, like nails dragging down the surface of the glass. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. The kind of presence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end, the kind that fills the space with a weight you can't shake. I quickly slammed my finger down on the radio. Hello? Anyone? My voice was more desperate now, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. But there was only static in response. No one answered. I had no choice. I had to investigate. My legs trembled as I stood up, every muscle in my body screaming to turn and flee. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening, what that thing was. I moved toward the door, my steps tentative, careful. The sound of my footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, each step feeling like it was dragging me closer to something I didn't want to confront. The closer I got to the storage section, the more I could feel it, the heavy atmosphere pressing down on me, the air thick with something cold, unnatural. My stomach twisted in knots, but I pushed forward. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle, and I could feel the weight of my own fear keeping me in place. The sounds, the shadow, the breathing, it was all too much. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, to get out before it was too late. But I had already come this far. I opened the door. The warehouse was dead quiet. Not a sound. Not even the distant hum of the fluorescent lights. Just cold, lifeless silence. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on the dusty floor. The air here was colder than the rest of the building, like the temperature dropped the moment I crossed the threshold. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just the same old shelves, the same broken equipment, the same forgotten corners. But then I heard it again. That sound. A whisper of movement in the dark. I whirled around, my eyes scanning every shadow, every nook and cranny, but saw nothing. The sound wasn't coming from the shelves, it was coming from the floor. I looked down, and that's when I saw it. A crack in the concrete. Small at first, but widening slowly, as if something beneath the surface was trying to break through. I stepped back, my breath quickening. This wasn't normal. There was no way this was just a coincidence. Something was down there. Something had been down there. Then, the floor groaned. And from the crack, something moved. It was quick, too quick, but I saw it. A shape, wriggling, slithering up from the deep, like a shadow coming to life. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The air was thick with the smell of something rotten, something decayed. I had to get out. Now. But as I turned to leave, I froze. The door I had come through, was no longer there. It wasn't just closed. It was gone. There was no handle, no frame. Just the smooth, featureless wall where it had once been. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, spinning in panic, trying to figure out what had just happened. How was this even possible? And then I heard it. The voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer. "Let me in," it said. The voice was coming from behind me, from the crack in the floor. I turned, and through the darkness, I could see it, something rising, something long and thin, like a pale hand reaching out from the depths. The voice was pleading, desperate. "Let me in, please." I need to see you. The hand reached higher, and I could see the fingers, long, bony, twisted. Each movement made the air crackle with static, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever was crawling out of that crack. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. My mind was paralyzed by fear, locked in place, watching as the thing emerged. It was coming. Closer. And then it stopped. The fingers twitched, the hand froze midair, hovering just inches from the floor. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. Let me in. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a command. The crack widened further, and I knew then that it wasn't just reaching for me. It was waiting for me to make the next move. And I wasn't sure if I could. I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The hand remained suspended in the air, its fingers trembling slightly, as though it was unsure whether to come closer or pull back. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, swirling in unnatural patterns, twisting and writhing like a living thing. I stood there, completely still, my chest tightening with every breath I took. The air had become stifling, almost suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic, no explanation. There was only the presence of that hand, reaching from the crack in the concrete, and the quiet, cold voice that now echoed in my ears. Let me in. I could feel the weight of those words settle around me, sinking into my bones. It wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. And as the fingers twitched again, I realized they were waiting for something from me. My heart was hammering in my chest, my legs like lead, unable to move. The crack beneath me grew wider, and something else began to emerge, more shapes, more tendrils stretching from the darkness below. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature plummeted even further, like the cold of the grave itself was rising to meet me. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone mad. Was this some sort of hallucination? Had I fallen asleep at my post, lost in some fever dream? But no! I could feel it. The cold, the pressure, the undeniable presence that was creeping up from the depths of the floor. I was no longer alone. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of scraping again, the same rhythmic noise I had heard earlier. But this time, it was louder. It wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from the walls. The sound of something scraping, something trying to break through the concrete, through the metal, through the very fabric of this place. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but my throat felt dry, tight. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, but every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into this nightmare. I turned around to face the wall, hoping to find some kind of escape. But there was nothing. No door. No window. Just the cold, empty expanse of concrete. The scraping stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Silent. But then, the voice came again, this time not just from the floor, but from all around me. Let me in, it's too late. The last words echoed, reverberating in the air, curling around me like a whisper in the dark. I felt my skin crawl. My instincts screamed at me to run, to break free of this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like something was pulling me back, keeping me in place, drawing me toward the crack in the floor. I turned, my eyes locked on the emerging tendrils, watching as they slithered and twitched, inching closer. They were thin and pale, like the fingers of some long-forgotten creature. And behind them, I saw it, its face, though it wasn't quite a face, not in the way I understood faces. It was an impression. A shifting shape, dark and blurry, like something that didn't belong in this world. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were wide, black voids, empty and hollow. And in those empty eyes, I saw everything. I saw the years of isolation, the years of waiting, the years of being trapped beneath the surface. And then it spoke again. Let me in. This time, the words weren't a request. They were a command. The walls began to tremble, the floor cracking wider, the cold air turning to a biting chill. The darkness pressed in, suffocating me, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around me, coiling like ropes, pulling me toward the thing that was emerging from the crack. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. My body was no longer my own. It was as if the very space around me was alive, moving, pulling me in. I had no choice. The hand reached for me, its fingers elongated, claws scraping against the concrete as it drew closer. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, suffocated by the darkness that was closing in on me. I could feel the coldness, the weight of it pressing against my chest, my lungs. It was like drowning, only in darkness. The thing was almost here. And then, just as it was about to touch me, the ground beneath me exploded. Not in the sense of an explosion, there were no flames, no fire, but in a violent rupture of sound, of pressure, of force. The crack in the floor burst open, releasing a wave of energy so strong it knocked me off my feet. The tendrils recoiled, the hand disappearing back into the abyss, as if it were being dragged down by some unseen force. The lights flickered wildly, the buzzing sound now deafening, and for a brief moment, the room was filled with a light so bright, it seemed to tear through the darkness. The shadows retreated, the air returned to its normal, still chill, and the scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I was lying on the floor, my body shaking, breath ragged, heart still pounding. The warehouse was quiet again. Too quiet. I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically. The crack was gone. The tendrils, the shadow, the hand, they were gone. But the air still felt wrong. It felt too thick, too heavy, like something had changed. I stumbled back toward the security booth, not daring to look over my shoulder, fearing that if I did, I might see it again. I grabbed the radio, my fingers trembling as I pressed the button. Hello? Anyone? My voice was shaky, barely a whisper, but there was no response. The booth was still empty. The lights flickered once more, casting strange shadows along the walls. But there was no one else here. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I thought I heard it again. The whisper. The voice. Let me in. But this time, it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from inside my own head. The silence returned, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. Not yet. The hand remained suspended in the air, its fingers trembling slightly, as though it was unsure whether to come closer or pull back. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, swirling in unnatural patterns, twisting and writhing like a living thing. I stood there, completely still, my chest tightening with every breath I took. The air had become stifling, almost suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic, no explanation. There was only the presence of that hand, reaching from the crack in the concrete, and the quiet, cold voice that now echoed in my ears. Let me in. I could feel the weight of those words settle around me, sinking into my bones. It wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. And as the fingers twitched again, I realized they were waiting for something from me. My heart was hammering in my chest, my legs like lead, unable to move. The crack beneath me grew wider, and something else began to emerge, more shapes, more tendrils stretching from the darkness below. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature plummeted even further, like the cold of the grave itself was rising to meet me. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone mad. Was this some sort of hallucination? Had I fallen asleep at my post, lost in some fever dream? But no! I could feel it. The cold, the pressure, the undeniable presence that was creeping up from the depths of the floor. I was no longer alone. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of scraping again, the same rhythmic noise I had heard earlier. But this time, it was louder. It wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from the walls. The sound of something scraping, something trying to break through the concrete, through the metal, through the very fabric of this place. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but my throat felt dry, tight. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, but every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into this nightmare. I turned around to face the wall, hoping to find some kind of escape. But there was nothing. No door. No window. Just the cold, empty expanse of concrete. The scraping stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Silent. But then, the voice came again, this time not just from the floor, but from all around me. Let me in, it's too late. The last words echoed, reverberating in the air, curling around me like a whisper in the dark. I felt my skin crawl. My instincts screamed at me to run, to break free of this nightmare, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like something was pulling me back, keeping me in place, drawing me toward the crack in the floor. I turned, my eyes locked on the emerging tendrils, watching as they slithered and twitched, inching closer. They were thin and pale, like the fingers of some long-forgotten creature. And behind them, I saw it, its face, though it wasn't quite a face, not in the way I understood faces. It was an impression. A shifting shape, dark and blurry, like something that didn't belong in this world. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were wide, black voids, empty and hollow. And in those empty eyes, I saw everything. I saw the years of isolation, the years of waiting, the years of being trapped beneath the surface. And then it spoke again. Let me in. This time, the words weren't a request. They were a command. The walls began to tremble, the floor cracking wider, the cold air turning to a biting chill. The darkness pressed in, suffocating me, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe around me, coiling like ropes, pulling me toward the thing that was emerging from the crack. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't fight it. My body was no longer my own. It was as if the very space around me was alive, moving, pulling me in. I had no choice. The hand reached for me, its fingers elongated, claws scraping against the concrete as it drew closer. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, suffocated by the darkness that was closing in on me. I could feel the coldness, the weight of it pressing against my chest, my lungs. It was like drowning, only in darkness. The thing was almost here. And then, just as it was about to touch me, the ground beneath me exploded. Not in the sense of an explosion, there were no flames, no fire, but in a violent rupture of sound, of pressure, of force. The crack in the floor burst open, releasing a wave of energy so strong it knocked me off my feet. The tendrils recoiled, the hand disappearing back into the abyss, as if it were being dragged down by some unseen force. The lights flickered wildly, the buzzing sound now deafening, and for a brief moment the room was filled with a light so bright it seemed to tear through the darkness. The shadows retreated, the air returned to its normal, still chill, and the scraping sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I was lying on the floor, my body shaking, breath ragged, heart still pounding. The warehouse was quiet again. Too quiet. I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically. The crack was gone. The tendrils, the shadow, the hand, they were gone. But the air still felt wrong. It felt too thick, too heavy, like something had changed. I stumbled back toward the security booth, not daring to look over my shoulder, fearing that if I did, I might see it again. I grabbed the radio, my fingers trembling as I pressed the button. "Hello? Anyone?" My voice was shaky, barely a whisper, but there was no response. The booth was still empty. The lights flickered once more, casting strange shadows along the walls. But there was no one else here. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I thought I heard it again. The whisper. The voice. Let me in. But this time, it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from inside my own head. The silence returned, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. Not yet. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt like it had thickened, as though it were charged with something dark, something ancient. My skin was crawling, every inch of me on high alert. My eyes flicked around the room, scanning for any sign of movement, any indication that whatever had happened moments before my return. I was trembling, and despite every instinct telling me to run, I couldn't bring myself to move. The radio in my hand felt heavy, as though it were pressing down on me, like an anchor to the reality I was trying to escape. I pressed the button again, hoping for a response, but the static crackled back at me, louder this time, almost as if mocking me. "Hello?" I tried again, my voice trembling, but still, there was nothing. I was alone. I forced myself to stand, though my legs felt weak, as if they would give way at any moment. I glanced toward the door, the spot where it had once stood, where it had disappeared. There was nothing there now. Just a wall, as solid and unyielding as the darkness that had enveloped me moments before. I needed to find a way out. I needed to get out of this place. My thoughts were scattered, wild, spinning like a vortex, but one thing was clear, I couldn't stay here. I turned back toward the storage area, my eyes darting between the empty shelves, the piles of forgotten boxes. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, the flickering lights casting strange shapes against the walls. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, a shape in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Nothing but the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. My hands were clammy as I gripped the edges of the booth, steadying myself, trying to collect my thoughts. I had to stay calm. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. But I knew it was. I remembered the voice, the whisper that had come from inside my own head. Let me in. The words were seared into my mind. I couldn't shake them. They reverberated in the dark corners of my thoughts, like a taunt I couldn't escape. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look around, trying to keep my focus. But the warehouse felt like it was shifting, stretching, distorting, as though reality itself was bending under some unseen weight. The temperature had dropped further, the cold settling deep in my bones. That's when I saw it again. A shadow, just beyond the doorway. It was no longer just a vague outline. It was solid, defined, its edges sharp against the dim light. The figure was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. It didn't move like a person. There was no walking, no shifting of weight. It just stood there, perfectly still, its presence a dark stain on the air. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to it, as if some force beyond my control was pulling me toward it. And then it spoke. Not through the air, not through the walls, but inside my mind. "I'm here." I gasped, stumbling back, my hands shaking. No. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. It stepped forward. Slowly. Methodically. Each step was deliberate, measured, and the darkness seemed to follow it, curling and slithering along the ground, pooling like ink. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, frozen in terror. The figure reached out, slowly, its long, thin fingers extending, its motion almost fluid, like it had all the time in the world. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive silence that surrounded me. And then, it was right there. Right in front of me. Its face, it wasn't a face in any normal sense. It was a blank, hollow void where eyes should have been, a smooth, featureless surface of pale, sickly skin. It leaned closer, the air around it growing colder, heavier. "Let me in," it whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't just in my head, it was in the very room, in the very air. The figure raised its hand, its fingers stretching toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Its fingers hovered just inches from my face. I could feel the cold radiating from them, like they were pulling the warmth from my skin, from my soul. And then, just as I thought it would touch me, it stopped. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, as if considering me, weighing me. The moment felt like it stretched forever. It was like time had stopped, the world frozen in place, leaving only the two of us, me, trembling, terrified, and it, waiting. It leaned in closer. Closer. I wanted to close my eyes, to pretend it wasn't there, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away. It spoke again, but this time it wasn't asking. "This is your choice," it said, the voice now low, like a growl from deep in the earth. "You can leave. Or you can stay." My heart was racing in my chest, my hands clammy with cold sweat. I didn't know what it meant. Leave? Stay? Was this some kind of game? But then, I realized. It wasn't offering me a choice. It was giving me a choice. The darkness around me seemed to tighten, the air thick with its presence. I had no idea what would happen if I left, what would follow me, or if I even could. But I knew, deep down, that staying meant something far worse. Something I couldn't comprehend. I backed away, my legs shaking. "Please," I whispered, barely able to force the words out. "Just leave me alone." The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was already gone. Just like that. Vanishing into the shadows without a sound, without a trace. The cold remained. The silence was deafening. But I was still there. Still breathing. Still alive. For now. I turned and fled. I didn't care where. I just had to get out. I had to get away. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet carried me forward, through the empty corridors of the warehouse, past the rows of abandoned shelves. The lights above me flickered erratically, casting brief, stuttering shadows that seemed to chase me as I moved. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a violent reminder of how close I had been to something I couldn't even begin to understand. The walls seemed to close in around me. The space was stretching, warping, like it was refusing to let me leave. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my skin, into my bones. My breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, but it felt like the air itself was turning against me, becoming thicker, heavier with each step I took. I needed to get out. I had to. But no matter which direction I ran, it felt like the walls were shifting, turning me in circles. The once familiar paths of the warehouse now seemed alien, twisted. I passed the same doorways, the same corners, over and over. It was like the place itself was alive, reshaping to keep me inside, to trap me. The low hum of the lights became a growl, almost a vibration, filling the air with a sense of wrongness. I could hear it now, too, the scratching sound again, but this time it was coming from above. It was like claws scraping against metal, like something was crawling along the ceiling, watching me from above. I dared to look up. The shadows above were moving, shifting. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. There was something up there. I didn't know what, but I could feel its presence, its eyes on me, even if I couldn't see it. My pulse quickened. The voice, that cold, whispering voice, returned. It was low, guttural, like something trying to break through, trying to crawl out of the walls. You can't escape. The words echoed in my mind, vibrating through my skull, resonating with a terrifying finality. I whipped around, desperately searching for an exit, for any way out. But everything was the same, empty, cold, and dark. There was no escape. I didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? My sense of time was slipping away, fading with each passing second. I was lost. Completely lost. The warehouse had swallowed me whole. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard something different. A sound. A soft, familiar sound. The faintest hum of machinery. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes darting toward the source. It was coming from down the hallway, past a long stretch of shelving. The noise wasn't just static, it was something real, something mechanical. Could it be? Was there someone else here? I took a tentative step forward, then another, moving toward the sound. My pulse quickened again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was hope, hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely alone. Maybe someone could help. As I rounded the corner, I froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was the control room. The glass windows that had separated me from the outside world. The same control room I had been watching from only hours before. But now, it was different. The glass was shattered. The monitors were cracked and flickering, showing static instead of images. The humming sound came from a machine in the corner, a generator, maybe, but it was malfunctioning, its lights flickering erratically. I stepped closer, my breath coming out in quick gasps. Something was wrong. The room was empty. But the hum grew louder, as if it were coming from somewhere else. Something was moving inside the walls. The shadow moved again, creeping through the broken glass, sliding into the control room with an unnatural fluidity. My feet were rooted to the floor, terror locking me in place. And then, I saw it. The figure. Not standing this time. Not watching. It was closer. Much closer. The pale, twisted fingers reached out through the shattered glass. The cold seemed to freeze the air around it as it reached for me, its long, bony hand extending through the hole in the wall toward the very place I stood. "Let me in," it whispered again, but now it was no longer a plea. It was an order, an inevitability. I knew I couldn't escape. The voice had followed me. The presence had found me again. There was no place left to run. I stepped backward, my heart racing, but I knew I couldn't outrun it. Not anymore. The hand was almost upon me. And then, just as I thought I would be swallowed by it, the door slammed shut. The world around me froze. The hand recoiled, vanishing into the shadows, the whisper fading into silence. I was alone again. Breathing heavily, I collapsed against the door, my mind spinning with confusion. What had just happened? What was real? What had just tried to pull me into the darkness? I turned, staring at the control room, the shattered glass, the broken machinery. It was silent now, still. But I knew. Whatever it was waiting for me to make the next move. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. It wasn't over. Not yet. And maybe it never would be. I could feel it in my bones. The thing was still there. Watching. Waiting. For when I'd finally open the door again. Have you ever heard something when you were sure you were alone? It happened to me last week. I was walking home late at night, the streets quiet, empty, except for the soft rustling of the wind against the trees. The night was colder than usual, and the sky was thick with clouds, hiding the moon. I passed the park, the one I always walk by, the one with the old swings and the stone bench by the pond. It was silent, too silent for a park at night. The city was still a few blocks away, but here everything felt distant, forgotten. Then I heard it. Laughter. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind. A kid playing somewhere nearby, maybe. But the laughter was too clear, too bright, for it to be from a distance. It felt like it was right next to me. I stopped. The laughter continued. But there was no one in sight. No children running around, no parents sitting on the benches. The park was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. I glanced around, heart beginning to race. The air felt colder. I stepped forward, toward the sound. It was strange, unnerving. The sound seemed to echo from the empty swings, but when I looked, they were still, unmoving. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. It was late, maybe I was just tired. I took another step, but the laughter stopped. Silence. For a moment, I stood there, listening to the silence of the park. The wind picked up again, and I could hear nothing but the usual night sounds. No children. No laughter. Nothing. I quickened my pace and kept walking. I didn't look back. The next day, I forgot about it. Just another odd moment, I thought. But the sound stayed with me. It echoed in the back of my mind, creeping in at odd moments when I was alone or when it was quiet. The thing is, I didn't expect to hear it again. Not so soon. It was 2 days later, around the same time. I was walking home from work, and I passed by the park once more. The night was cold, the air sharp. But this time, as I neared the entrance to the park, I heard it again. That laughter. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was multiple. A group of children laughing, playing. The sound was high-pitched, like they were having fun, like they were enjoying something. And still, there was no one there. I stopped in my tracks, my heart starting to race. The sound felt wrong. Too wrong. There was something about it, something about the way it echoed off the empty park, like it wasn't from the real world. I looked around, scanning the dark corners of the park. The swings were still, the slides stood empty, and the benches were abandoned. The laughter, it was coming from nowhere. It was closer now, like they were right next to me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My breath came out in quick bursts. I couldn't see anything, couldn't understand what I was hearing. It was then that I noticed something on the ground near the entrance. A bracelet. I bent down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. It was a simple silver bracelet, delicate, with a small charm shaped like a star. I turned it over in my hands, a strange feeling settling in my chest. I knew this bracelet. It had belonged to my sister. She had worn it for years. It was her favorite. But that didn't make sense. My sister had passed away when we were kids, years ago. She had been in the park the night she disappeared. I froze, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. The park. The laughter. The bracelet. It was all too much. I stood there, holding the bracelet, my fingers numb, trying to make sense of it. The laughter was still there, in the back of my mind, echoing faintly. It was as if the park itself was alive, and the past had come rushing back to claim me. But how? How could it be her? How could she be, laughing, calling to me from the darkness? I didn't know what to think. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't just leave it there. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening, what the park was trying to tell me. I walked away from the park that night, the bracelet still clutched tightly in my hand. But the laughter didn't fade. It followed me, like it had never stopped. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the park, about that laughter, about the bracelet. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, those innocent, joyful voices echoing in my mind. I tried to push it all aside, to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But something inside me refused to let it go. That bracelet. It didn't make sense. I had known it for years. My sister had worn it when she was alive, before she disappeared all those years ago. She had been so young, only 8, the same age as the voices I'd heard. The park was where she had been last seen, the place she had vanished from. No one had ever found out what happened to her. And now, that bracelet, in the park, at night. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to go back. That night, I found myself standing at the entrance of the park again. The sky was thick with clouds, the air heavy, like it was holding its breath. There was a chill in the air, colder than it should have been for this time of year. I stood there for a moment, staring at the familiar gates. The park looked different in the dark. The trees were bare, their branches swaying in the wind like twisted fingers reaching for the sky. The path leading into the park was dimly lit by the streetlights, but the light was weak, flickering, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch out of the ground and into the night. I hesitated, but I had to know. I stepped into the park. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. It was like stepping into another world, one that didn't quite belong to the present. The sounds of the city faded, leaving only the eerie stillness behind. My footsteps echoed on the path, too loud in the silence, as if the park itself was listening. The laughter. I heard it again. It was faint at first, just like before, distant and soft, but it grew louder as I walked deeper into the park. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't see anyone. The swings were empty, swaying ever so slightly in the wind, and the slides were still, their surfaces cold and untouched. Then I saw it. At the far end of the park, near the old stone bench by the pond, there was something. Something moving in the shadows. I stopped in my tracks. The shape was small, crouched low to the ground, and it wasn't moving like a person. It was too erratic, too unnatural. It seemed to flicker in and out of the darkness, like it couldn't quite decide whether it belonged there or not. The laughter was louder now, more insistent, surrounding me. I moved closer, cautiously, my breath coming out in shallow gasps. I had to know what it was. What was happening here? I was almost there when the figure stopped moving. It froze, and then it turned toward me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. My pulse quickened, my legs growing heavy as I tried to take another step forward. The laughter was now ringing in my ears, sharp and clear, but there was something wrong with it. It was no longer innocent, no longer playful. It was hollow, empty. I reached out my hand, trembling, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from the shadows. And then, as if responding to an unspoken command, the air around me grew colder. The laughter twisted, turning into something dark, something sinister. The voice spoke. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice soft, but it sent a shiver through my body. "We've been waiting for you." My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. It took a step toward me, and then another. I could see it now. The figure was no longer flickering in and out of existence. It was solid, standing before me, a small child, but its face, it wasn't right. Its eyes were hollow, dark, with no pupils, no emotion. The skin was pale, too pale, and stretched too tight over the bones, like it hadn't seen the light of day in years. It was wrong. All wrong. The laughter filled my ears again, louder this time, until it was deafening. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the gravel, my chest tight with panic. The child reached out, its hand like a shadow, its fingers long and bony. I could feel the air around me growing colder with every step it took. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice repeated, louder now, almost shrill. "She's here. She's with us." I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the path, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the laughter followed me. It echoed off the walls of the park, filling the air with its chilling sound until it was all I could hear. I didn't stop until I was outside the park, gasping for breath, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I looked back, but the park was silent again. The laughter was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I held the bracelet in my hand, my sister's bracelet, the same one I had found days earlier. And I understood. She was still here. She was still part of this place. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, torn between disbelief and terror. The park, the laughter, my sister. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was too real. I couldn't shake the image of that child, its hollow eyes and twisted grin. The words it had spoken still echoed in my mind. She's here. She's with us. It was too much to understand, too much to process in one night. But I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The next day, I didn't tell anyone. How could I? How could I explain what had happened, what I had heard, what I had seen? No one would believe me. They'd think I was crazy. But the need to know, to understand, was stronger than my fear. I decided to go back to the park. But this time, I had to be prepared. I couldn't go in unarmed, unready for whatever waited for me there. So, I gathered my courage and grabbed something I thought might help, my sister's old journal. She had kept it when she was younger, writing down her thoughts, her dreams. I hadn't opened it since her disappearance, but now I felt like it might hold the key to everything. Maybe it had answers. Maybe she had written something that would explain why the park, why that voice was so familiar. I sat down at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of me, and began to read. Her handwriting was just as I remembered, messy but full of life. She had written about the park often. About the swings, about the pond, about the days she'd spent there with me. But there was something odd in one of the entries. Something that sent a chill down my spine. I think I saw something in the park today. A shadow. It followed me. I tried to tell Mom, but she said it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. I stopped reading for a moment, the words swimming in front of my eyes. A shadow. She had seen it too. She had felt it. I turned the page, my hand shaking, and found another entry. I don't like going to the park anymore. There are voices in the wind. They call me. I don't know what they want, but I feel them. They're always there. Watching me. I think they're waiting for me. I closed the journal, my breath caught in my throat. My sister had known something. She had sensed it, just like I did. But what was it? What was in the park, lurking in the shadows, watching us? I knew I had to go back. I had to face whatever this was, whatever had been waiting for me and my sister. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't leave the past unanswered. That night, I went to the park again. The air was thick with mist, the world around me shrouded in an eerie quiet. The sounds of the city seemed miles away, replaced by the heavy silence that hung in the park. I walked slowly, my footsteps almost soundless on the damp grass. The park was as empty as always, but tonight it felt different. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, as if it was alive, pressing against my skin, suffocating me. I walked toward the old stone bench by the pond, the place where I had found the bracelet. The laughter wasn't there. Not yet. But I could feel something in the air. Something wrong. Something that didn't belong. I sat on the bench, clutching the journal and the bracelet in my hands. My heart raced, each beat louder than the last, each thud echoing in the stillness. I waited. And then I heard it. At first, it was faint. A whisper in the wind. But it grew louder. The laughter, high-pitched, like children playing. But this time, it wasn't playful. It was mocking. It was like they knew I was here. Like they were watching me. I stood up, my hands shaking, and looked around. There was nothing there. Just the shadows, the trees, the empty swings. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. A figure. A child. It was standing at the edge of the pond, its back to me. I could barely make it out in the darkness, but it was there. It was real. The laughter stopped. The figure turned toward me, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Its face was obscured, just like before. But this time, I could see the outline of its body more clearly. It was thin, too thin. Its skin stretched tight over the bones. It was wrong. The voice came again, soft but sharp. "You're too late," it said. "She's ours now." I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the air growing colder, the weight of the park pressing down on me, suffocating me. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved toward me. Slow, deliberate steps. It was coming closer. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was right in front of me. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The thing was inches away from me, its face just out of reach. And then, slowly, it raised its hand and touched my chest. The contact was cold. Ice cold. It burned. I gasped, but no sound came out. And then I heard it. A voice. A familiar voice. My sister's voice. "Help me," she whispered, barely audible. "Help me, please." I felt a tug at my soul, a pull toward the darkness, toward the park, toward whatever was in that thing's eyes. I closed my eyes, shaking my head, trying to push away the voice, trying to shut out the pain. But then I remembered something. The bracelet. My sister's bracelet. I had to fight. I reached for the bracelet in my hand, squeezing it tight, holding on to the memory of her, of the love I had for her. And with that, the figure recoiled. The laughter faded. The coldness lifted. For a moment, everything was still. Silent. And then the voice, my sister's voice, whispered again. "Thank you." The park went quiet. The shadows seemed to melt away, leaving nothing but the stillness. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I walked out of the park, the bracelet still clutched in my hand. The laughter was gone, and the voices had stopped. But something inside me had changed. And I knew that whatever had happened here, whatever had been waiting for me, was still out there. Still watching. But it was over for now. And I would never forget. The days that followed felt strangely ordinary. I went back to my usual routine as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I couldn't shake the memory of that moment, the cold touch, the hollow eyes, and the voice of my sister, faint but clear. I kept the bracelet close, always. It was a reminder, a piece of her, and it grounded me when I felt like I might lose control. But I also couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, that the park wasn't finished with me. The world around me seemed quieter, like a heavy fog had descended over everything I did. It wasn't just a park anymore. The whispers had followed me, creeping into my thoughts when I wasn't looking. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were waiting for me to step into them. And sometimes, when I walked alone at night, I thought I could hear the laughter again, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder the longer I listened. I had to go back. but not yet. Instead, I reached out to someone who might understand. A woman I had known years ago, someone who had studied things like this, the supernatural, the unknown. Her name was Evelyn, and she had always been fascinated by the kinds of things people like me would dismiss as just stories. I called her. She didn't answer. I left a message telling her everything about the park, the laughter, the figure, the voice of my sister. I didn't expect her to call back, but I needed to say it out loud, needed someone to hear me, to validate what I was going through. The next morning, I was surprised to find a message from her. Meet me at the old library at 7 p.m. We need to talk. I didn't hesitate. I drove there that evening, my mind racing with questions. What had she found? Did she know something about the park, about the voices? The old library smelled like dust and forgotten stories. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the walls were listening. Evelyn was sitting at one of the tables, a stack of books in front of her. She looked just as I remembered, dark hair, sharp eyes, her face framed by the soft light of the setting sun through the windows. You came, she said, her voice low and serious. I wasn't sure you would. I sat down across from her, my hands gripping the bracelet in my pocket. I had to. Something's happening. I can't explain it. She nodded, her eyes narrowing as if weighing my words. I've seen this before. Not exactly like this, but similar. People who have lost someone close, tend to feel things they don't understand. She paused, her fingers tracing the edges of an old book on the table. But what you're describing, it's more than that. What do you mean? I asked, my voice tight. The voices, she said slowly. The laughter, the presence. It's not just a memory. It's a doorway. A connection. And you're not the first to hear it. The park is a place where those who disappeared, those who are lost, are still tied to the living. It's like they're waiting for something, for someone, to hear them. I felt a chill run down my spine. My sister, she's still there, isn't she? Evelyn didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Your sister is part of it. But so are the others. They're trapped, caught in a loop. And they're reaching out, trying to pull you in, pull others in. They don't understand that they're gone. But you do. That's why they want you. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. I don't understand. How do I stop it? Evelyn pushed the stack of books toward me. You can't stop it. Not completely. But you can end it for yourself. You have to face what's left in that park. And when you do, you have to close the door. You have to let your sister go. I stood up, my hands shaking. How do I do that? Go back, she said. Go back to the place where it started. And let go. The weight of her words sank in. I wasn't just going back to the park. I was going back to face everything I had been running from. The voices, the laughter, the thing that had been waiting for me. I was going to have to confront it. And in doing so, I would have to say goodbye to my sister. For good. I drove to the park that night, feeling like I was walking into a storm. The air was thick with mist, the park silent except for the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. I knew I had to do this, but the fear was overwhelming. I walked through the entrance again, the same path I had taken before, and everything felt heavier. The world seemed to close in on me, the darkness swallowing up the light. The laughter wasn't there this time. It was silent, like the park was holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. I made my way to the old stone bench. The pond was still, its surface smooth as glass. The world around me seemed suspended in time. I sat down, clutching the bracelet in my hand, and waited. Nothing happened at first. The wind blew, the trees swayed, and everything was eerily quiet. But then, just as I thought it was over, I heard it. The laughter. It was soft at first, distant, but growing closer. I closed my eyes, feeling the presence of it all. The voices, the memories, the spirits that were trapped here, waiting for someone to hear them. I felt my sister's presence. I could hear her, faintly, so faintly, like she was right beside me. And then, I whispered the words I had been afraid to say for so long. "I'm letting you go." There was a pause, a heavy silence, and then, a soft breath. A sigh of relief, maybe. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I love you. I'll always love you." And then, everything changed. The air shifted, the mist parted, and the laughter faded away, like a door that had been closed for good. The park grew quiet again, but this time it was peaceful. The weight lifted, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew it was over. But as I walked away from the park, I heard something one last time, just a whisper, carried on the wind. "Thank you." And then, there was nothing. Just silence. Peace. I had let her go. And I knew that, no matter what happened next, I would be okay. The weeks after that night passed in a blur, a quiet calm that felt both surreal and comforting. The park no longer called to me. The laughter, the whispers, the eerie feeling of being watched, all of it was gone. The heavy, suffocating presence that had clung to me for so long had finally lifted. And yet, there was a part of me that could never forget. A part of me that would always remember. I visited the park a few more times in the days that followed, but each time it was different. No more laughter. No more shadows. Just the peaceful rustling of leaves and the sound of birds overhead. The once haunted place had become normal again. Just a park. Just trees, swings, and an old pond. But even as the world around me settled into this new peace, I knew things had changed. I had changed. It wasn't just a park that was different, it was everything. I found myself walking through my daily life with a new awareness, a deeper understanding of the fragility of life, of the invisible threads that connect us to those we've lost. The fear that once gripped me now felt like a distant memory, but its echoes remained, guiding me through each day. I kept the bracelet with me, always, tucked safely in my pocket. It had become a symbol, not of the darkness I had faced, but of the love that had remained. It reminded me of my sister, yes, but also of the strength I hadn't known I possessed. Of the courage to let go, to say goodbye when it was time. One afternoon, as I sat at my kitchen table, the phone rang. It was Evelyn. "Are you doing all right?" she asked, her voice gentle, as though she already knew the answer. "I'm fine," I replied, surprised by the calmness in my own voice. "Everything's quiet now. The park, it's peaceful." "I know," she said. "I can feel it. It's done." We talked for a while longer about what had happened, about what I had faced, and about the strange connection between the living and the dead. She listened patiently, offering words of understanding, as always. When the conversation ended, I set the phone down and looked out the window, watching as the sun began to dip behind the trees. I thought about my sister, about the memories we had shared, about the bond that had never truly been broken, even by death. I had faced the darkness, faced the unknown. And in the end, I had learned to let go, to move forward, to live without fear. But there was one last thing I had to do. I stood up and walked to my front door. I opened it, and without a second thought, I walked out into the evening air. The park was just down the street, its outline visible against the fading light. I didn't know why I felt the need to go there again, but something inside me told me it was time. As I entered the park, I felt no fear, no dread, just a quiet sense of peace. The same peace that had settled over me in the days after that night. I walked to the pond, stood by the water's edge, and closed my eyes. I held the bracelet in my hand, feeling its cool surface against my palm. "I'm here," I whispered softly, not expecting a response. "I'm still here. I remember you." And as I stood there, in the fading light of the evening, I felt it. A presence. Not one of fear or sorrow, but of love. A warmth that surrounded me, comforting me, telling me that everything was okay. My sister was at peace. And so was I. I smiled, the weight on my chest lifting for the last time. I knew, without a doubt, that this chapter of my life was finally closed. And as I turned to leave the park, I didn't look back. But I knew, deep in my heart, that the voices would never truly disappear. They would always be there, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the living and the dead. But now, they were just memories. And memories were all I needed. The park, once filled with shadows and whispers, had become a place of healing, of letting go. A place where the past could rest. A place where I could live without fear. And with that, I walked away. Have you ever woken up only to find that something small but important, was wrong? Like the world was just a little bit off? It wasn't until I got out of bed and glanced around the room that I realized it. The clocks. All of them. Every single clock in my house had stopped. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I had simply forgotten to wind the old grandfather clock last night, or perhaps a power surge had knocked the others out of sync. But no! The digital clock beside my bed, the small wall clock in the hallway, even the little kitchen timer, none of them were working. The hands on the grandfather clock were frozen at 5:29, and the digital clocks all showed a jumbled string of numbers that didn't make sense. I tried to remember what time it was. My mind felt slow, confused, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was late for work, that much I knew. I could feel the panic creeping up as I rushed to the bathroom, brushing my teeth and splashing water on my face, all while mentally calculating how much time I had left. The strange thing, though, was that everything outside my windows seemed to be moving in slow motion. People weren't rushing to work, cars weren't honking, and the world just seemed still. Silent. I shook it off as I dressed quickly, grabbing my jacket and keys before heading out the door. As I walked down the hallway of my apartment building, I noticed no one was in a hurry. A few neighbors were standing in their doorways, chatting, but none of them looked rushed. I glanced at my phone, hoping it would give me some answer, some confirmation of the time. But the phone screen flickered, then froze. I had no idea what was happening. I just knew that I had to get to work. When I stepped outside, I was met with an unusual calm. The air felt thick, like the usual hum of the city had been muffled, as if the whole world had been suspended. People walked by, their faces vacant, as though they were all stuck in the same strange trance. No one was looking at their watches or phones. No one seemed to care about the passing of time. I started walking toward the subway station, but my steps felt too slow, my body weighed down by the strange, unexplainable tension in the air. And then it happened. A distant sound, like a voice, calling my name. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper on the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I glanced behind me. No one. The street was empty, just the distant hum of the city that had once been so familiar now felt strange and wrong. I arrived at work a few minutes later, but the sense of unease didn't leave. I stood outside the building for a moment, staring at the clock above the door. The time read 10:05, and yet I felt something shift inside me. That gnawing feeling deep in my stomach that I had missed something, that something was terribly out of place. Inside the office, everything was just as it always was, employees typing away at their desks, papers scattered on tables, phones ringing. But when I stepped into the office, the receptionist looked up at me with wide, shocked eyes. "You're late," she said. "Where have you been?" I froze. Late? I glanced at the clock on the wall again. It read 10:05. But "I'm not late," I said, my voice faltering. "I'm on time." She shook her head. "No, you're an hour late. You should have been here by 9. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How could that be? I checked every clock I could find, on my phone, my watch, the office clock. All of them showed the same thing. 10:05. But in my mind, something told me that wasn't right. Something was wrong with time itself. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked, her tone a mix of concern and confusion. I nodded, but I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure of anything. I made my way to my desk, the other employees glancing up at me as I passed by. They seemed distant, as if they were all caught in some sort of fog. I couldn't place it, but the atmosphere in the office felt off. The hum of conversation, the rustling of papers, it all sounded distant, muffled, as though it was coming from far away, not from the room I was standing in. I sat down at my desk, still trying to make sense of the confusion in my mind. It wasn't just the clocks. It was everything. I kept glancing at the time, each second passing slower than the last. My thoughts felt fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that I couldn't fit together. And then, I heard it. The soft ticking. It was coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. The room was silent again. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand why everything felt wrong. The ticking continued, a faint, steady rhythm, and I found myself walking toward the source of the sound, drawn to it. There, in the corner of the room, I saw a small, old clock on the shelf. It was ticking, but the hands were moving backward. I reached out and touched the clock, and as I did, I felt a jolt of static electricity run through me. The world around me seemed to blur. The office, the people, the clocks, they all seemed to bend and warp, like they were stretching, pulling apart. And then, for just a moment, everything stopped. The ticking stopped. The voices stopped. The world stood still. Time had frozen. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was trapped in this endless moment, this eternity where nothing moved, where nothing mattered. And then, just as quickly as it had stopped, everything began again. The ticking resumed. The voices returned. Time, it seemed, was moving forward once more. But something had changed. Time was no longer reliable. It no longer followed the rules. I wasn't sure if I had crossed over into a different reality or if I had simply lost my mind. All I knew was that I had to find a way to escape, to break free from this strange, warped world where time no longer made sense. But the question lingered in my mind. Was time broken, or was it me? The hours passed in a haze. Time, in its usual sense, felt like a distant memory, something that had slipped through my fingers, leaving behind only confusion and doubt. I glanced at my computer screen, the digital clock there flickering between numbers, but always resetting itself, as if taunting me. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was just a glitch, just a malfunction. That's all. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The office continued as if nothing had happened, as though the strange dissonance in the air wasn't hanging over us all. People walked by, chatting, typing, but I could see it in their eyes. Something was wrong. They were aware of it too, but no one spoke of it. I stood up from my desk, pacing, feeling the need to move, to do something, anything. My mind raced, thoughts colliding with each other, none making any sense. How could I be late when nothing had changed outside? No one was rushing, no cars were honking, the streetlights were still glowing as if time hadn't passed at all. I found myself at the window, staring out at the street below. The people outside moved in slow, fluid motions, their bodies disconnected from the usual rhythm of the world. No hurry, no rush. Just life, moving, but not moving. I couldn't put it into words, but the scene was alien to me. It wasn't the world I knew. It was like watching a paused movie, frozen and yet not. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned around to see Clara, one of my colleagues, standing behind me, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low, hesitant. I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that time felt wrong? That everything I knew had been twisted somehow? Instead, I simply nodded. "I'm fine. Just tired." Clara gave me a doubtful look but didn't press further. Instead, she turned and walked back to her desk. I watched her go, feeling a strange wave of isolation wash over me. How could they not see it? How could they just go on, as if everything were normal? I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave, to get out of this place. I grabbed my coat, not bothering to check the clock again. I had no idea if it was morning or evening at this point, and stepped outside. The city felt different now. There was no sound of cars rushing by, no hum of distant conversations. The air was still. People walked in an eerie calm, their faces expressionless, as if they, too, were trapped in some kind of suspended moment. I decided to walk to the park. Maybe being outside, away from the office, would clear my head. The park was usually peaceful, a place where I could think and escape the noise of the world. But as I approached, something caught my eye. A man standing by the fountain. He was looking at his watch, frowning, checking it over and over. His actions weren't frantic, but there was a desperation in his eyes that made my heart race. I took a step closer, but the man didn't notice me. He was completely absorbed in the watch, as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. I could hear his muttering faintly now, his words indistinct but filled with frustration. "I'm late. It's not supposed to be like this." He paused, glancing at me, his eyes wild. "You too? You feel it, don't you?" "Time, something's wrong with time," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Before I could respond, he turned and began to walk away, his steps quickening as though he was trying to outrun something invisible. I watched him disappear down the path, unsure of what to make of it. But that moment, the look in his eyes, it had confirmed what I had feared. I wasn't the only one. Time wasn't just slipping away from me, it was slipping away for everyone. I turned and walked back to the office, my mind spinning. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think straight. Was this happening to everyone? Was this some kind of collective experience? Or was it just me? I stepped back into the building, greeted by the same muted atmosphere. No one seemed aware of what had happened, of what was happening. Everyone was still working, still carrying on with their tasks as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything had changed. I made my way back to my desk, but when I looked up at the clock again, it read something different, 9:30. I froze, staring at the numbers as they flickered. A sense of dread surged within me. I had just left for the park, and it had felt like hours had passed. But now, time had just reset itself. I looked around the office. No one else seemed to notice. No one questioned it. The world just kept turning, even though time itself had become a blur. I tried to steady my breathing, to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just trapped in a distorted moment. No, this was something deeper, something much more unsettling. I wasn't just experiencing a strange glitch in time, time itself was being manipulated. There was no escape from this, not as long as I stayed here. But where could I go? How could I find the answers? I looked at the clock again. It had started ticking once more. But with each passing second, the sense of dread grew heavier. Was I running out of time? Or was time itself running out on me? Everything was off. Everything was slipping away. And the longer I stayed in this place, the less I knew if I could ever get back to the world I had known. The rest of the day passed in a blur, though I couldn't tell you exactly what I did. I moved through the motions like an actor in a play I didn't understand. My body was there, but my mind was elsewhere, struggling to grasp onto something solid. I'd look at the clock, 10 minutes would pass, then an hour, then it would flicker and reset, always showing the same thing, time moving forward, yet somehow not moving at all. The office, too, was a surreal landscape. People continued typing, talking, laughing as if everything were completely normal, but I noticed things they didn't. Their movements were slower, more deliberate. A conversation would start, but halfway through, one person would forget the point and the other would just smile, nodding as if the thought had been finished. I glanced over at Clara again. She was sitting at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. But something about her posture, her stillness, reminded me of the man in the park, the one checking his watch over and over. Clara wasn't moving much at all. She wasn't even typing, just staring at the screen. As I looked closer, I noticed her fingers weren't even touching the keys. I took a step toward her desk, my feet making soft taps on the carpet, and when I got close enough, I saw her lips moving, but no words came out. Her face was vacant, lost in whatever strange loop time had put us in. I stood there for a few moments, trying to decide what to do. The air around me felt heavy, like it was pushing down, making it harder to think clearly. Finally, I reached out and tapped her shoulder. "Clara?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her head jerked to the side, her eyes wide. She blinked rapidly, as if waking from a trance. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss something?" she asked, her voice soft, almost apologetic, like she hadn't noticed the strange distance between us. I didn't know how to respond. "No," I said, shaking my head. "You didn't miss anything." But the truth was, I had missed something. Something had shifted in her, something had shifted in all of us. "I'm going to get some air," I said quickly, turning away before she could respond. I needed space to think, to breathe, to try and make sense of everything. I grabbed my jacket and left the office. The moment I stepped outside, the same stillness greeted me. I looked around, hoping to find something, anything, that would ground me. The park was a few blocks away, and I figured maybe going there again would help. Maybe I just needed to clear my head. The city streets felt even quieter than before. The usual hum of the cars, the chatter of pedestrians, it was all muffled, as though it was happening in a different world. The world I was in felt empty, like I was walking through a dream, or worse, through a nightmare. I turned a corner and found myself standing in front of the park's entrance. It was a strange sight. The park that had once been a place of peace and solitude now felt oppressive. The trees stood like dark, looming figures, their branches twisting in unnatural directions. The grass beneath my feet felt too soft, too yielding, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. And there, in the middle of the park, the fountain still trickled water, but the sound was distorted, like it was coming from underwater, distant and muffled. I stepped inside, the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes the only sound in the air. My heart was racing now, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and fear. As I walked deeper into the park, I began to hear something, soft whispers, like a crowd murmuring in the distance. But the park was empty. There was no one here but me. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though they were coming from the trees themselves. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. Only the wind, rustling through the leaves, carrying the sound of voices with it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling in the stillness. No answer. But the whispers didn't stop. They swirled around me, growing more insistent, as if they were beckoning me, pulling me deeper into the shadows. I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady, as the sound seemed to draw me toward the center of the park, toward the fountain. When I reached it, I stopped dead in my tracks. The man who had been standing here earlier, the one who had muttered about being late, was standing there again, his back to me, staring down at the water. But this time, there was something different about him. His body was completely still, unnaturally still, and his hands were clasped tightly around his watch, as if he was holding onto it for dear life. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge me at all. His hands tightened around the watch, and then, with a sudden, jerking motion, he yanked it off his wrist. He tossed it into the fountain. The watch sank with a soft splash, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, the whispers stopped. I didn't know whether I should stay or run. The air around me felt colder now, the park more oppressive. The man remained motionless, and I felt the strangest urge to leave, to get as far away from this place as I could. But when I turned to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around. The man was following me. Except now, he wasn't walking at all. He was floating. His feet were inches above the ground, and he was drifting toward me, slowly, silently. I turned and ran. My heart thudded in my chest as my legs pumped faster, the air growing colder with each step. But the sound of his footsteps, no, his floating steps, echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the park, and when I finally dared to glance behind me, the man was gone. But something had changed. The world was even more still now, as if time itself had taken another step backward. And I realized, with a growing sense of terror, that I might not be able to escape it. Time was no longer just wrong. It was hunting me. I barely slept that night. The events of the day, the whispers, the floating man, the feeling of time slipping away, replayed in my mind over and over. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't make sense of anything. Time wasn't just off, it had become something malevolent, something that had a life of its own. I woke up the next morning and immediately checked my watch. It was still broken, just like every other clock in the house. It was as if they were all stuck in the same moment, trapped in a loop that wouldn't let them move forward. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I glanced at the clock on the wall, stopped at exactly 3:15. I had no idea why, but I knew that time wouldn't start again, not until it was ready. I pushed myself out of bed, my body stiff and weary. The world outside was still quiet, too quiet. I dressed mechanically, my mind still fogged from the previous night's events. I didn't want to go outside, but I knew I had no choice. I had to figure out what was happening, even if it meant losing my mind in the process. The streets were empty again as I made my way to work. No honking cars, no chatter of people hurrying to their destinations. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something big and terrifying. When I entered the office, everything seemed normal. But it wasn't. I could feel it in the air, the tension, the heaviness. Everyone was moving in slow motion. Their eyes were glassy, their movements jerky, like they were struggling to stay tethered to this reality. The chatter that had filled the space the day before was replaced with an eerie silence. Every desk was occupied, but no one was working. They just sat there, staring blankly at their screens. I tried to talk to Clara again. She was at her desk, her fingers still resting on the keyboard, unmoving. When I spoke her name, she turned to look at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Clara, are you okay?" I asked, my voice tight with worry. She didn't respond right away. She just stared at me, as though she hadn't heard the question. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "It's happening again." "What do you mean?" I asked, my throat tight. Her eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, still frozen at 3:15, and she shuddered. "I don't know, but I feel it. It's like everything is stuck. Like we're stuck in the same moment over and over, and we can't get out." I swallowed hard. Her words echoed the thoughts I'd been having all along. The whispers, the floating man, the feeling that time was hunting us, none of it made sense, but somehow, Clara's confession made everything feel even more real. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "It's like we're trapped in a nightmare. And the worst part is, I don't think we're going to wake up." Clara nodded, her face pale. She was the only one who seemed to understand, but that didn't bring me comfort. It only made the situation feel more dangerous. If Clara, who had always been so grounded, so practical, was scared, then there was no hope for any of us. Suddenly, the office door swung open, and in walked Mr. Hawkins, the office manager. He looked just as unsettled as the rest of us, but there was something more deliberate about the way he moved. It was almost as though he was following a script, repeating motions he had done 1,000 times, but now they felt wrong. "Morning, everyone," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I trust we're all ready to get started." The room didn't respond. No one moved. "Isn't it a bit late to be starting, Mr. Hawkins?" I asked, my voice strained. It's already 3:15. He didn't react to my words. Instead, he glanced at the clock on the wall, the one that had been frozen since yesterday. His eyes lingered there for a moment, and then he turned back to us, his smile now a little too wide. "Well, it's never too late to start, is it?" he said, as if the words meant nothing. I felt a chill run through me. The smile was too wide, too fake. It didn't reach his eyes. And for the first time since I had come into the office, I realized something that made my stomach drop. None of them were real. They were all stuck in this moment, just like me. And I didn't know how to get out. I looked back at Clara, hoping for some sign, some reassurance that we weren't completely alone in this, but she was gone. Her desk was empty, her chair swiveling slowly as if she had just vanished into thin air. I glanced around, panic rising in my chest. "Clara?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The room was silent once more, the air thick with tension. And that's when I heard it, the soft, indistinct murmur of voices, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming from everywhere, beneath the floorboards, through the walls, from the very air itself. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they weren't just whispers. They were a warning. The clock on the wall flickered again, its hands moving just slightly before stopping again. A second passed, and then another. The stillness grew heavier, and I felt it in my chest, a suffocating pressure, as if the world itself was closing in on me. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The voices grew louder, more distinct, until I could hear them clearly. "Get out, before it's too late." I turned, but the door was gone. The windows, too. The walls were closing in. There was no escape. And then, just like before, time stopped. Everything froze. And I realized this was the moment I'd been running from. This was where time had brought me. And there was no going back. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. The voices around me had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was deafening. The world outside was no longer there. It was as though I had been erased from time itself, caught in a void where nothing could move, where everything simply was. I tried to scream, but the sound was strangled in my throat. My body felt heavy, like I was underwater. Every movement was sluggish, unnatural, as if the laws of physics had been altered, twisted into something foreign. I reached for my phone in my pocket, hoping to find some sign of life, some connection to the world outside, but it was dead, just like everything else. I had no idea what time it was, or if time even mattered anymore. I looked around the office, seeing the faces of my coworkers still frozen in place. They were caught in the same nightmare, their blank expressions carved into their features. The dim fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting strange, jerky shadows that made the walls seem to pulse with an unnatural life. The air felt thick, almost solid. I couldn't breathe, but I wasn't suffocating. I was stuck in a moment that had no beginning and no end. Then, Through the suffocating stillness, a single figure appeared. It wasn't Mr. Hawkins, at least, not the version of him I had known. His face was distorted, his eyes empty black pits. He moved toward me with a slow, deliberate pace, his footsteps soundless on the floor. "You don't belong here," he whispered, his voice a hollow echo that seemed to reverberate in my bones. "None of you do." I stepped back, my heart racing. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real, could it? He wasn't real. "You're trapped," he continued, his lips barely moving. "This place, this time, it's not for you. You were never meant to exist here." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mind spun as I tried to make sense of them, but the more I thought, the more confused I became. My memories felt fuzzy, like something was off, like they had been altered. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. Complete darkness. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could feel my breath catch in my chest as frost began to form on the edges of my vision. Then, from the blackness, I heard the softest sound, a faint ticking, like a clock winding up, but the tick was irregular, almost distorted, like the seconds were getting lost in the process. It was a maddening sound, one that echoed in the pit of my stomach, making my skin crawl. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, holding me in place, keeping me from escaping whatever this was. My pulse thundered in my ears as the ticking grew louder and louder. And then, I saw it. At first, it was a flicker, just a shadow at the edge of my vision. But as I blinked, the shape became clearer. It was a figure, its outline blurred, like it was made of smoke or fog. It stood tall, unmoving, right in front of me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence, like it was staring directly into me, through me. It was the floating man. The same one I had seen the night before. He had followed me here. "No," I whispered, backing away, my chest tight with fear. "This can't be real." The figure's form wavered as it began to step closer, the sound of its footsteps impossible to ignore. Each step felt like it was drawing the very fabric of reality closer to its breaking point. The walls around me seemed to pulse with life, as though the room itself was aware of what was happening. "You can't run from time," the figure said, its voice distorted, warped beyond recognition. "Time is coming for you. It's already too late." I turned, desperate to escape, to break free of whatever this was. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't get anywhere. The office stretched on endlessly, a maze of desks and walls that refused to change, as though the space itself was looping around me, trapping me in the same place over and over. The clock on the wall finally ticked once more, just a single, slow tick, and then the hands moved forward. They didn't just move normally, though. The second hand jerked and snapped into place, the hour hand spinning wildly. Time was unraveling. Everything around me began to collapse. The walls cracked, the floor fractured, and the air itself began to shimmer. I could feel myself being pulled, like something was yanking me backward, dragging me into the dark nothingness. And then, everything went silent. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't in the office anymore. I wasn't even in the same world. It was like I had been transported somewhere else entirely. The sky above me was dark, the air thick with the weight of forgotten memories. I looked around, but there was nothing. No one. I was alone. The sensation of time slipping away, of being out of sync with the world, was still with me. But now, I was aware of something else. A low, humming sound, almost like a pulse, was coming from somewhere deep inside the ground, or maybe even from the sky above. It was the heartbeat of the place I had found myself in, this void that wasn't real, but wasn't entirely unreal either. The moment stretched, and I realized I wasn't just stuck in time. I was caught in a place beyond it, where nothing had meaning, where time had no power. And I wasn't sure if I had escaped or if this was the end. Everything was still, and I had nowhere to go. Have you ever walked down a road that felt like it had been waiting for you? A road that seemed to have existed long before you stepped onto it, as if it had always been there, just hidden, waiting for someone to discover it? I didn't think such roads existed, not until I stumbled upon one myself. I had been walking for hours, just to clear my head. The sky had been heavy with clouds all morning, and a breeze had started to stir, carrying the faint scent of pine. It was one of those walks where you don't really have a destination in mind. You just let your feet carry you wherever they want to go. At some point, the path I was on began to narrow, winding through a dense forest of trees whose trunks were thick with moss. I hadn't noticed when the trees started to change, but suddenly they were towering, ancient things, their bark gnarled and twisted like they had stories to tell. It was as if I had stepped into a different world, one that existed outside the normal flow of time. I wasn't sure why, but something about the place felt wrong. There was a certain stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. Curiosity, I suppose, got the better of me. So, I kept walking deeper into the forest. And then, I saw it. It started out as a faint outline, barely visible through the thick trees. A road overgrown with weeds and leaves that seemed to lead nowhere. The stones that made up its surface were weathered and cracked, the mortar between them almost entirely gone. I couldn't remember seeing a road like this before, and I was sure I hadn't walked this way when I first entered the woods. There was something almost ancient about it, as if it had been forgotten by everyone but me. I hesitated, wondering if it was a trick of my mind. But there it was, stretching out before me like an invitation. I couldn't ignore it. The pull was too strong. I stepped onto the path, and the moment my foot made contact with the stone, a strange chill washed over me. The air grew heavier, and the trees around me seemed to bend closer, as though they were watching. The road didn't look like it had been used in years. The trees had grown so thick on either side that they nearly closed it off entirely. Still, I pressed on, moving slowly, my footfalls muffled by the moss that seemed to grow with a life of its own. The further I went, the less I could hear. The usual sounds of birds and wind faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know how long I had been walking when I finally saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The road curved ahead, and through the trees, I saw the ruins. They were faint, partially obscured by overgrown vines and shrubs, but they were there. The remains of a building, or perhaps a structure, crumbled and forgotten by time. I could barely make out the shape of it, but there was something haunting about it, something that tugged at a memory I couldn't quite place. Curiosity pushed me forward, and I reached the ruins in a matter of minutes. The stones were broken and scattered, the walls collapsing inward, consumed by the earth. But then, as I looked closer, something caught my eye. A stone, partly buried under dirt and leaves. I knelt down, brushing off the debris, and saw it clearly. It was my name. Not just any name. Mine. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the faint engraving. The letters were old, worn by years of weathering, but they were unmistakable. Evelyn was carved into the stone, clear as day. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling as I traced the edges of the letters. How was this possible? I had never been here before. I had never even heard of this place. And yet, there it was, my name etched into a stone that had clearly been there for far longer than I had. A shiver ran down my spine. My head was spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Who had left this? Why was my name here? And why, after all these years, was I the one to find it? I stood up slowly, scanning the ruins again, feeling like the walls around me were closing in. It was too much, too strange. The silence of the forest seemed to deepen, and for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched hit me like a wave. The trees were still, but I could feel eyes on me, something hidden in the shadows, waiting. I wasn't sure if it was the remnants of the old road or the ruins themselves, but I knew I had to leave. Whatever it was, it didn't want me here. But before I could turn to leave, I heard it. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. Evelyn. The hairs on my neck stood on end. It was my name again. But this time, it wasn't just an engraving on a stone. It was a whisper, carried on the wind, so close I could almost feel the breath against my ear. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned around, but the forest was as still as it had been before. No one was there. The voice, if it had even been a voice, was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just reached out to me from the past, from a time I didn't know. Something, or someone, was waiting. And the road I had found was only the beginning. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to run, and started back down the path. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the road was still following me. That I was being drawn deeper into something far older, far darker than I could ever understand. And I had no idea where it would lead me next. I didn't stop walking. I couldn't. The silence around me felt like a thick, suffocating blanket, and every step I took echoed unnervingly through the trees. The road, which had once seemed like an invitation, now felt like a trap. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I wasn't meant to understand. The whisper of my name still lingered in the air, faint but persistent. My heart pounded in my chest, but I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. After all, there was no one here. The ruins had been empty when I found them. It was just an old road, long forgotten by time, and the name carved into the stone, well, that could have been anyone's. The forest was old, and people had wandered through it for centuries. But even as I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. The voice. The name. Everything felt connected in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if the past and the present were colliding, and I was stuck in the middle. I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out, but the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. The road stretched out in front of me, but I hesitated. There was something in the air, something that made me doubt every decision I had made. I should have turned back, I should have left, but my feet wouldn't obey. Instead, I kept walking, my eyes scanning the trees nervously, half expecting something to leap out from the shadows. And then I saw it again. Another stone. This one wasn't hidden beneath the leaves. It was right in the middle of the path, plain and visible. I approached it cautiously, my breath catching in my throat when I saw the same thing, my name. But this time, the engraving was different. It wasn't just a name. It was a sentence. You shouldn't have come back. The words seemed to shimmer in the fading light, as if they had been freshly carved, though the stone was clearly old. My stomach twisted in a knot, and I stepped back, my heart hammering harder than before. A chill ran through me, and I felt the weight of the air pressing in on me, as if the very trees were holding their breath. I turned around quickly, hoping to find some sign that I was imagining things. But the path behind me was empty. The forest had grown quieter, too quiet. There was no breeze, no sound of birds, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the world itself had paused. Then, the ground beneath me shifted. At first, it was subtle, a slight vibration, barely noticeable. But it grew stronger, the earth trembling beneath my feet. The trees creaked, their branches swaying as if they were moving of their own accord. The very ground seemed to be alive, shifting and groaning as if something was trying to wake up from a long, deep slumber. I turned quickly, looking for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. But before I could move, the whisper came again. This time, it was louder, more urgent. Evelyn. The voice wasn't the wind this time. It was clear, distinct, and coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The path was empty, the forest silent again. But the whisper didn't stop. It echoed in my ears, surrounding me. Evelyn, come closer. I froze. My body felt like it was locked in place, my mind racing with confusion and fear. What was this? What was calling me? The air grew colder, the shadows around me deepening, and I felt a presence, something ancient and powerful, looming just beyond my sight. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, barely visible in the growing dusk. But it was moving toward me, slowly, almost deliberately. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, instinctively wanting to run, but my feet felt glued to the earth. The figure came closer, its shape becoming clearer. It was tall, draped in dark clothing, a hood obscuring its face. As it drew nearer, the air grew colder still, and the trees seemed to recoil, as if afraid to get too close. The figure didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. It just moved closer, its presence heavy in the air, as if it had always been there, waiting. I took another step back, my heart racing. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get away from this thing, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I could only watch as it approached. When it was only a few feet away, it stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rapid pounding of my own heartbeat. Then, the figure raised one hand slowly, its fingers outstretched toward me. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew deep down that whatever this was, it was connected to the road, to the ruins, to my name, to me. The figure opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, a vision flashed before my eyes, something I hadn't expected. A place, unfamiliar yet hauntingly familiar. The ruins again, but this time I could see them as they once were. A grand building, strong and imposing, surrounded by life. People walking, laughing, talking. A time before the ruin, before the decay. And then I saw it. My name carved into the walls. Not just the stone. The whole building. It was everywhere, marking the very bones of the structure. The vision vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving me breathless, disoriented, and terrified. The figure was still standing before me, its hand outstretched, as if waiting for me to take it, to follow it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should run or reach out. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stay here. Who are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging my question. Then, without a word, it turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the trees. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Should I follow it? Was this some kind of warning, or was it guiding me towards something? Before I could make a decision, the ground trembled again, this time more violently. The trees shook, and I heard a distant rumbling, like the sound of a storm breaking in the distance. The air felt charged, crackling with an energy I couldn't explain. I had no choice. I had to follow. As I took the first step forward, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the trees closed in around me. The old road was no longer just a path, it was a gateway. And I wasn't sure where it was leading me. The path ahead was shrouded in shadow, the trees so dense now that the light from the fading day barely reached the ground. My feet felt heavy, each step seeming to drag me deeper into the forest. I glanced back once, but the figure had vanished. Whether it was real or just a trick of my mind, I couldn't say. But the cold, the unease, the sense of something being terribly wrong, it was real. And it was following me. The road stretched ahead, winding its way through the thickening trees. I could hear the low hum of the forest, the whisper of branches in the wind, but something was different. The usual sounds of the woods, the chirping of insects, the rustle of animals, were absent. Only the oppressive silence hung in the air, suffocating in its stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My footsteps were louder now, a rhythmic pounding that felt too sharp, too obvious. As if the trees themselves could hear me. The weight of every step pressed down on me, like something invisible was pulling at my legs, urging me to slow down, to stop. But I couldn't. Something had shifted. I was no longer just a wanderer in the woods, I was being led. And I couldn't turn back. I reached another stone. This one was larger than the others, weathered and jagged, its surface rough with age. But as I drew closer, I saw it clearly, and my blood ran cold. There, carved into the stone in the same neat script as before, was my name again. But it wasn't just my name this time. It was a phrase. You were here before. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I felt dizzy. The words blurred before my eyes. How could this be? I had never been here before. I had never seen these stones, this road, this place. Yet, the engraving was undeniable. You were here before. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pull in my gut. A connection I couldn't explain, yet it was there, tangible. The words felt like a memory, though I couldn't place them, as if something had been waiting for me, calling me back to this spot. A sudden gust of wind rustled the branches above me, and in that fleeting moment, I heard a sound, a soft creaking, like the slow turning of an ancient wheel. It came from the direction I was walking, deep within the forest. The sound was faint but unmistakable. I hesitated. My instinct screamed for me to turn around, to leave this path and never look back. But something in me, the same force that had driven me forward despite the fear, pushed me onward. I moved past the stone, my breath shallow, my heartbeat quickening. The air felt heavier now, charged with an electric hum. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, brushing against my skin. I swatted at them absently, but it didn't feel like they were just trees anymore. It felt like they were watching. Then, I saw it. The ruins. They weren't far ahead, hidden just beyond a dense thicket. The stones of the old building stood tall, though they were crumbled and broken. Once majestic, now shattered by time. The walls had fallen in some places, but enough remained to give it shape, an outline of what it once was. And there, at the center, was the most striking feature, the same carving. My name. Everywhere. The words were etched into every surface, the stone walls, the broken pillars, the crumbled remains of what had once been a grand structure. It was everywhere. You were here before. I stepped forward, unable to tear my eyes away from the inscriptions. It felt as though the words were alive, swirling around me, echoing in my ears. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound, a footstep. No, not a footstep. A shuffle. I spun around, my heart racing. No one was there. But I could feel the presence. A cold, creeping feeling that gripped my chest and shoulders. It was like being watched, stared at, though there was no one there. I took a step back, the ground crunching beneath my shoes, and looked around frantically. Then, I saw it again. A shadow. A figure. Standing just at the edge of the ruins, barely visible in the fading light. The figure was tall, but this time it was different. It wasn't cloaked in darkness. It was illuminated by the faint glow of the setting sun, a ghostly silhouette standing motionless among the ruins. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, frozen in place by fear. The figure didn't move either. It just stood there, its form eerily still, watching. And then, it did something that made my blood run cold. It lifted one hand, slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at me. The air around me seemed to crackle, and my breath caught in my throat. The figure's hand remained outstretched, pointing at me as if it was beckoning me forward, urging me to come closer. Something in me screamed to run, to escape, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. The pull was irresistible, like a magnet drawing me closer. Every instinct I had told me to turn and run, but my body refused to obey. I took one slow step toward the figure, and the air around me seemed to grow colder. The shadows deepened, twisting in strange shapes around the ruins. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't just distant murmurs. They were all around me, growing louder, pressing on me from every direction. You were here before. The words rang out in my ears, louder now, clearer than ever before. They were the voice of the figure. They were the voice of the ruins. They were the voice of the past, calling me back to something I couldn't remember. I was no longer just walking down a path. I was retracing steps I had taken long ago, steps I had forgotten. And the ruins that seemed so ancient, so lost in time, were waiting for me to remember. But what had I forgotten? What had I left behind? The figure's hand lowered, its form beginning to fade into the twilight. It was almost as if it had never been there, a mere illusion in the growing darkness. I reached out, but before I could get any closer, the ground beneath me trembled once again. The stones around me shifted, groaning as if the entire ruin was awakening. And then, without warning, everything went dark. I woke up with a start, my body jerking upright as if I had been dragged from some deep sleep. My breath was heavy, shallow, and the weight of it hung in my chest, like the air itself was too thick to inhale properly. The darkness around me was absolute. No stars, no moonlight filtering through the trees, just an impenetrable blackness that swallowed everything. For a moment, I wondered if I had simply dreamed it all, the road, the stones, the figure. But the deep ache in my limbs, the coldness that had seeped into my bones, told me otherwise. This wasn't a dream. This was real. I reached out, my hand brushing against rough stone. I was sitting on the ground, my legs tucked beneath me. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle in my body protesting. I was dizzy, disoriented, my thoughts scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. How had I ended up here? The ruins, the figure, the road. The air felt charged now, heavy with an ominous energy that made my skin prickle. It was as though the very space around me was vibrating, a low hum that buzzed in my ears. My eyes strained in the darkness, but I could see nothing except the faint outline of the ruins, the shattered stone walls still looming like sentinels. I took a hesitant step forward, my foot crunching on something beneath me, but I couldn't see it, couldn't make out any details. The ground felt uneven, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath my feet. The whispers came again. You were here before. This time, the voice was different. It wasn't the ghostly whisper I had heard before. It was clear, deep, and unmistakable. It reverberated through the air, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze, my entire body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I wasn't alone. There was a rustling sound from behind me. Something moving, something approaching. Slowly, carefully, I turned, but there was nothing. The space around me seemed vast, yet every corner felt like it was closing in. I took another step. The silence was deafening now, more oppressive than before. I had no idea where I was going, but there was only one direction, forward. I had to move forward. The voice echoed again, louder this time, more insistent. You were here before. You cannot leave. You must remember. I stumbled, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath coming faster as panic set in. The ground felt unstable, like it was shifting beneath my feet. I could feel something, no, someone, watching me from the shadows. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed, as if my body was no longer my own. Every instinct screamed for me to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. It was as if the darkness itself held me captive. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. The same tall shape from before, standing just beyond the ruins, watching me. This time, it was clearer, more solid, its form unmistakable. But its face was hidden in shadow. A hood, a cloak, all obscured in blackness. I wanted to scream, to run, but again, I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, my eyes locked on the figure as it began to approach me. Every step it took sent a ripple through the darkness, and with each step, I could feel the ground tremble beneath me, the air growing colder. You were here before, the voice repeated, but this time it was more than just a phrase. It was a command, an undeniable truth. The figure stopped in front of me, its presence suffocating. It was close enough now that I could feel its breath, cold, distant, like the air of the grave. And then, the figure spoke. You remember, don't you? The voice was not the same as the whisper I had heard earlier. It was deep, heavy, filled with an ancient knowledge I couldn't comprehend. The words struck me like a physical blow, sending a shockwave through my body. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. It felt like I was suffocating, like the very air around me was thickening, pressing in. The figure's hand reached out, slowly, deliberately, and I couldn't stop myself from taking a step back, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. "You belong here," it said. "You were always meant to be here. This road, this place, it calls to you." I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest, the sound of it loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I was paralyzed, caught in the figure's gaze. The world seemed to shift, bending and warping around me. The ruins faded from view, replaced by an image of a place I recognized, yet couldn't place. It was a house. My house. But not like it was now. This house was whole. It was alive with light, with warmth. There were people inside. Laughter. The smell of food. It was a memory of a time long gone. A time I have forgotten. The figure's voice echoed again, this time inside my mind. "You were here before. This is your home. This is where you belong. Come back. Come home." The words filled me with a deep, overwhelming sense of dread, but also something else. Something darker. Something familiar. The figure's hand reached out again, and this time I couldn't resist. I took its hand. The moment I did, the ground beneath me seemed to dissolve. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the world shifted again, faster this time. I felt myself falling, plummeting into nothingness, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around me. And then, with a sudden jolt, everything stopped. I opened my eyes. I was back. Back at the road. But everything was different. The forest was gone. The trees. The ruins. The path, it had all vanished. I was standing on the edge of a familiar street. My street. But it wasn't quite the same. The houses were different, their shapes distorted, their windows dark and empty. The world was silent, unnervingly still. And as I looked around, I saw it. Carved into the sidewalk in front of me, etched deep into the concrete, was my name. You were here before. It wasn't just a name anymore. It was a truth. I had been here before, and I would never leave. I stood frozen, staring at the concrete beneath my feet where my name was etched, an impossible, undeniable truth. A chill ran through me, deep into my bones, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me wasn't just unfamiliar, it was wrong. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, but the name was still there, carved as if it had always been. You were here before. The words echoed in my mind, like a haunting refrain. I stepped back, almost tripping over my own feet. There was no way this was real. It couldn't be. How could I be standing here? How could this street, this place, feel so alien, so cold? I looked around. The houses were the same, yet not. Their shapes twisted, their colors too dark, too muted. The air itself felt wrong, stagnant, like time itself had stopped flowing here. The silence was deafening, the kind that presses against your ears until it becomes suffocating. I took a slow step forward, my heart racing, a knot of dread tightening in my chest. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. The name on the sidewalk felt like a tether, pulling me towards something I couldn't understand, couldn't explain. The sky above was a flat gray, the kind of sky that makes you feel like you're trapped under a heavy, endless weight. I looked up, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but nothing seemed right. The buildings loomed like silent sentinels, their windows dark and empty, watching me. The trees that lined the street were twisted, their branches stretching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. And then I heard it. A soft sound at first, so faint I almost thought it was my imagination, a whisper drifting on the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it became impossible to ignore. You were here before. The voice was the same one I had heard in the ruins, but now it was all around me, surrounding me. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a chorus, as if the very world was speaking to me, calling me back. I turned, looking in every direction, but there was no one there. The street was empty, and yet I could feel the presence of something watching me, something waiting. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, twisting around me like they had a life of their own. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my legs shook beneath me. I felt trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. My name, was everywhere. Carved into the sidewalk. Scrawled on the walls. Whispered on the wind. It was as if I had always been here, as if this place had been waiting for me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. There was no way out. Come back, the voice urged, its tone growing more insistent, more desperate. Come home. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get away. I had to leave this place, but my legs felt like lead, and the more I tried to move, the more the world seemed to close in on me. The shadows deepened, stretching toward me like hungry tendrils, and the whisper grew louder, closer. You were here before. The words felt like they were inside my mind now, like they were crawling into my skull, taking root, becoming a part of me. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, like something, was walking toward me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The air around me thickened, and I turned, expecting to see the figure from the ruins, but instead, I saw something else. A person. A woman, standing at the end of the street. She was facing away from me, her back to the faint, gray light of the sky. Her figure was blurry at first, like a mirage, but as I blinked, she became clearer. She was tall, dressed in dark clothing, her long hair flowing like a black curtain down her back. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. She didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me. But I knew, somehow, this was the same woman I had seen in the ruins. The same woman I had seen in my dreams, standing just out of reach, watching me from the shadows. The same figure whose voice had haunted me. The woman took a step forward, and then another. Her steps were soft but sure, the sound of her shoes on the pavement sending a ripple of terror through me. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey. As she drew closer, I could see her face more clearly, though there was something about it that made my stomach turn. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, empty, like deep wells of darkness that threatened to swallow everything. And when she spoke, her voice was not hers, it was 1,000 voices, all saying the same thing. You were here before. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words stuck in my throat. She was too close now, standing just in front of me, her presence overwhelming. She reached out, and her hand, cold, like ice, touched my cheek. Come back, she whispered, her voice now soft, almost pleading. Come home. And in that moment, I understood. I understood everything. This place, this road, these ruins, it wasn't just a place. It was a memory. A past I had forgotten, a past I had left behind. And now it was calling me back. I looked into her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, and saw myself. It was me. It had always been me. And as I stood there, frozen, I realized that there was no escape. I had never left. This was home. This was where I belonged. And now I was trapped here forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.